significant differences across countries, with oil exporters upgraded to higher energy prices and production in the line with the OPEC Plus agreement, and the most emerging market and middle-income countries and low-income countries downgraded. In the CCA region, real GDP is projected to grow by 2.6% in 2022, a 1.5 percentage point downgrade from October, which reflect the profound impact of the war in Ukraine on the countries in the region. Downside risks dominate the outlook and include a prolonged war with further sanctions on Russia. This raises food and security concerns and the risk of social unrest, tighter than expected global financial conditions which could trigger capital outflow, persistent inflation, and more pronounced slowdown in China. This difficult environment and the uncertainties ahead have created extraordinary complex policy trade-offs, especially for oil-importing countries with limited policy space. So, how can countries manage these trade-offs while maintaining focus on tackling long-term challenges? In the near term, there are several policy priorities countries should consider. First, adjusting monetary policy based on country circumstances to control inflation and avoid derailing the recovery. Given market volatility, exchange rate should be allowed to adjust with interventions used only to prevent market disruptions. On fiscal policy, oil exporters have the opportunity to rebuild buffers. In emerging market and middle-income countries where fiscal space is limited, growth-friendly fiscal consolidation prioritizing health, social spending, and investment will be critical. Tackling rising global food and energy prices is vital. While allowing domestic prices to gradually increase, countries should compensate vulnerable households and firms with transparent, temporary, and targeted transfers. Garnering international cooperation to prevent a food security that could exacerbate the already dire conditions facing low-income countries will equally be important. The path to recovery continues to require effectively managing the pandemic, which is why expanded global and regional effort to provide equitable access to comprehensive COVID-19 toolkit are needed. With the limited policy space, structural reforms have become even more important to prevent scarring from the pandemic and war and ensure a private sector-led inclusive recovery. Specific priorities include reallocating public expenditures toward expanded and better targeted safety nets as support measures are withdrawn, increasing revenue-generating capacity to ensure fiscal sustainability, promoting the private sector and reducing informality to foster growth and inclusion, and adjusting to climate change through adaptation. I would encourage you to read our recently published departmental research paper on the key climate issues the region faces and how adaptation can be a component of a comprehensive climate strategy. The IMF continues to work closely with the region, providing policy advice and technical support, as well as $20 billion in financing to the Middle East and Central Asia region since the beginning of the pandemic. The fund has also allocated $49.3 billion of special drawing rights to supplement the region's reserves assets, which will help countries cope with policy trade-offs. The IMF's recently approved Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which will help steer resources to countries that need them most, could also help in this effort. Next month, we will hold a virtual launch event spotlighting the MENA region, and I'm looking forward to visiting the Caucasus and Central Asia to highlight more findings from the Regional Economic Outlook report and what they mean for countries as they continue working toward transformation and recovery. With that, I would like to thank you again, and I will be happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Jihad.
Thank you,
we will
Wafa.
now take your questions. Please raise your hand and turn your cameras on when you ask a question. We do have interpretation, Arabic and French, and we do have questions online. So I will first take any questions that are on Webex. Yes, please go ahead. You raised your hand. David, please go ahead. David Dowder.
Oh, hi. Good morning. Thank you for doing this. I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about the food security issue being caused by the war in Ukraine, particularly for countries like Egypt and others that depend on grain from Ukraine and Russia, that Black Sea region. What is the IMF doing to kind of work with these countries to ease that pain? Obviously, you're in discussions with Egypt about a program. How will that be changed by the need for maybe additional support for food security? Thanks.
Thank you, David, for your question. In fact, the food security issues is an important priority for countries in the region. It has affected countries in different ways. First, it has led to increase in prices, and the component of wheat and food in the price index is high. It constitutes more than 40 to 60% in certain cases. Therefore, the first impact is a price impact. For a certain number of countries, it's a supply or sourcing impact because most of their wheat is imported from Russia and Ukraine, and therefore those countries have an additional issue above only the problem of prices. And here, I think it's very important to separate between countries. Low-income countries have low level of reserves and high dependence on wheat, and therefore those countries are the most affected. We assess I would say, the heat map of the food security issues on the region. Countries need between 0.3% of GDP in terms of additional cost to, in certain cases, 1 to 1.5% of GDP. With most of those countries who are wheat dependent, and in addition to the issue of price effect, that they have the sourcing effect, with most of them we have already programs. And as you know, David, in the past, during the COVID crisis, we have been very accommodative by adjusting our programs and adding certain number of adjusters to allow those countries to increase their capacity to supply or to import those kind of products. Broadly speaking, we are also, with other institutions, the World Bank, World Food Program, and other institutions, working collectively in order to see how we as collectively we could provide more support to countries who are facing these problems today and tomorrow. And I would like to add another dimension, which is access to fertilizers, which is not the problem of today, but problem for the next year.
Thank you, Jihad. Kambiz, please go ahead. You're next.
Thank you so much. This is Kambiz. I'm with Voice of America in Washington, D.C. Two questions. One is, we briefly talked about this food shortages. I know IMF always forecasts for the issues for the years to come, but the Ukraine issue causes huge food shortages for Iran and Iraq in the region. What are the best first step remedies for these two countries to could grasp it? Second question I have from my readers, they just wanted to know, in general, they had this question, it comes up all the time. I don't have a good answer, so I thought maybe you could provide one. When a country like Islamic Republic, a government like Islamic Republic is under series of regime sanctions, how does that work? Can IMF even bypass those sanctions and work with the country which is in need, and in any case that they need, they present their case? How is that going to work? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this question. Again, the food security issue is an important issue for many countries in the region, including Iraq and Iran. And here, I think the way we assess the problem is it only a price issue? Is it an issue of supply? And it's an issue of affordability. Those countries who are the most, I would say, affected are the low-income countries and countries in fragility, with a low level of reserve capacity and very high dependence on wheat. In certain countries, it could reach to 60 or 67% in their food basket dependence on wheat, which is not the case for Iraq and Iran. Iraq, let me start with Iraq. Iraq has, with the increase as well as also Iran in oil price, the capacity to supply, to source any additional demand for wheat as well as also for any other food item. In the case of Iran, the economic situation, as you know, has recovered gradually, and the wheat and the basic commodities are not part of any sanction regime. Of course, the increase in prices has led to some additional pressure on social protection. And this is what we, in fact, recommend countries, especially when we see the level of inflation going up, like in the case of Iran, where inflation has exceeded double-digit in the last 2 years, is to widen the social safety net. Widening the social safety net is by providing targeted and temporary transfers to those who are in most need to be able to address two issues. One issue, the issue of affordability, and the second issue, the issue of compensated for the high increase in prices.
Thank you, Jihad. We'll go with Ibrahim Ma'moul next. Please introduce yourself and the organization you work for. Thank you.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Ibrahim Ma'moul from Middle East News Agency from Egypt. I want to ask about the communication between the IMF and Egypt on having a new loan. When would we expect to receive an approval on this loan? And what would it be, a quick loan like COVID-19 support, or would it be received on intervals? And I have another issue with the Federal Reserve is expected to raise the USA interest rate by half percentage. So what do you expect on its influence on Egypt? Thank you. Sorry for having.
Sorry, could you repeat? I had the problem listening. Could you repeat the second part of the question about the US?
Okay, the Federal Reserve is expected to raise the interest rate by half percentage.
Yes.
So will it have a big influence on the Egyptian economy? What do you expect for it?
Well, thank you for your two questions. On the first one, as you know, the fund has been supportive to Egypt over the last few years. We have provided two programs to support the reform agenda of Egypt back in 2016, and also to help Egypt address the shock of COVID in 2020. And the fund stands ready to support Egypt going forward. As you know, authorities have requested the support from the fund. The team has started technical discussions with the authorities. These discussions are progressing. Of course, Egypt is one of the countries that have been facing direct and indirect impact of the war in Ukraine. Direct impact because of the strong relation with Russia and Ukraine in terms of supply of food and wheat in particular, but also the impact on tourism. In addition to that, the indirect impact is because of the volatility we see in capital markets and the impact of potential tightening or more than expected tightening of monetary policies. And already the government of Egypt has started to introduce certain number of measures by addressing the risk of inflation and adjusting interest rate, adjusting the exchange rate, as well as also providing a fiscal package to provide additional protection to the low-income people. On the second question, of course, the case of Egypt is equivalent to several emerging markets where the tightening of monetary policy in advanced economy is having an impact. It's having an impact in terms of increase in spreads, increase in rates, but also in terms of capital flows. The way to address this is through a comprehensive reform package that the Egyptian authorities are putting in place, and the fund is in current discussion with them to find the best way to help them.
Thank you very much, Jihad. We're going to stay on Egypt because we do have a few questions on Egypt. I just wanted to acknowledge that we did receive the same question from Dua Abdel Men'aim from Ahram, and we do have another question from Yasmin Salim from Masrawi, and this is going to be in Arabic, so for interpretation. هل مستويات الدين
What about the level of foreign debts in Egypt? Are they worrisome? And what is the impact of inflation on the economy in Egypt?
Different question.
شكرا. فخليني ابتدئ بالشق الثاني من السؤال.
Let me start with the second part of the question. Of course, the increase of the inflation following the COVID-19 crisis is having a huge impact on many countries in the region, including Egypt, where inflation reached 10.5% for this year, and this is higher than the goal that was expected within the monetary policy. And this, of course, goes back to the changes at the economic level, the pressure on supply chains, and the rise in demand. There is also the increase in oil prices, and lately is a huge increase in food prices, which, of course, is having an impact on the food index and food prices in Egypt. And as I said previously, the government in Egypt and the central bank in Egypt worked on changing interest rates in order to reduce inflation. And this is one of the main goals, to preserve price stability and also the stability of the economy as a whole. The second point about debt in Egypt. Of course, it is high, as is the case of many countries importing oil. And debt is very important when adopting economic policies. In particular, in the case of Egypt, the foreign debt is not that high. The main part of the Egyptian debt is in local currency.
Question from Sarah Al-Isawi, Al-Ahram Daily. The Egyptian president announced assignments to the government yesterday to confront the financial crisis, focused on supporting the private sector and its participation in the economy, expanding government offerings in the Egyptian stock exchange, supporting the national industry, and dealing well with the debt problem, in addition to a number of other decisions. How do you see the impact of these decisions on supporting the economic and financial situation and limiting the challenges that the Egyptian economy faces as a result of the global situation?
Well, of course, during uncertain times, it's very important to make sure that your macro economic policies are set in a way to protect your economy from any external shock. And Egypt is currently facing external shocks from the war in Ukraine and from the volatility in the capital markets. To make sure that both prices are under control, because increase in prices and inflation affects your social stability, and to make sure that your fiscal situation is geared toward protecting those who are the most in need and allow your economy through capital investment to grow. Therefore, it's normal to make sure that you have the right policy set. And also, those are moments where you rethink your priorities to maintain the high level of growth. Over the last 5 or 6 years, Egypt was able to maintain a fairly good level of growth, and in the last 2 years, despite the COVID shock. And it's important going forward to maintain high level of growth, to create the needed jobs for 700,000, 800,000 young people who enter the market, but also to shield the economy from external shocks, especially that those shocks are affecting the balance of payment and also affecting the fiscal situation, and make sure that through structural reforms you allow the private sector to lead in terms of growth and to create additional value. Those are the key pillars that the reform program Egypt is having. And based on those, we are, for example, in our case as a fund, discussing with the authorities.
Thank you very much. We have one question on the CCA.
Yes.
From Nino Kvindratsi from Formula TV, Georgia. Inflation is rising globally amid the war, despite central banks' attempts to combat it with tight monetary policy. How can governments in the Caucasus and Central Asia tackle inflation? Do you think the priority today should be economic growth, for instance, investing more on infrastructure, which is somewhat a pressure on prices? Or do you think it's not a right time for governments to increase demand when the prices are on its peak already?
And this is a very important question today for Caucasus and Central Asia. As we know, Caucasus and Central Asia region is one of the most affected parts of the world because of the war in Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia. Given their strong economic and financial ties with Russia, as well as also with Ukraine, those countries are already affected by this shock. It has increased prices because of the increase in energy price and food supply. It has also affected, in certain cases, their exchange rate because of the strong links historically with the ruble, and also for some of them affected the level of remittances, giving the strong trade relationship between them and Russia. Therefore, those countries are the most affected directly, but also indirectly because of the increase in inflation worldwide, increase in interest rates. And it's very important for authorities in those countries to, A, preserve stability and to introduce immediate measures to address the first wave of the shock, which is most of them have dealt with it by allowing the exchange rate to absorb part of the shock, triggering through monetary policy by increasing rates to keep inflation under control, as well as also providing certain direct and targeted transfers to help those who are the most affected socially by the crisis to reduce the brunt of the increase in prices or reduce their suffering. Of course, this crisis requires to maintain the course of policy coordination for the immediate future, but also for the medium term, preserving macroeconomic and as well as also financial stability, addressing the issues of increase in prices and risks of inflation, and gradually working for a landlocked region to diversify the source of supply, trade routes, and also increase intra-regional exchange and trade. Each country has its own situation. During the spring meetings, we have a very fruitful discussions with authorities who have been taking certain number of actions. The fund is already engaged with many of those countries, not only through policy advice and technical assistance, but also in certain cases through financial support.
Thank you, Jihad. We'll go for questions on Webex now. Nehed Jandoubi, please go ahead.
Good morning. سوف أطرح سؤالي بالعربية.
I will raise my question in English. Thank you, Mr. Amr and Mr. Azour. In regards to the talks in Tunisia, and especially the technical part with the IMF, yet the structural reform that is proposed by the Tunisian government is waiting for your approval. What are the outcome of those reforms? How do you assess the recent visit of the Tunisian delegation to Washington, D.C., and what was provided in terms of the negotiations, and what is the percentage of reaching an agreement? And Mr. Azour as well, in terms of the economic outlook for Tunisia in the short term, if you can kindly talk on that, please. Thank you.
Tunisian journalists Samia Abu Khatem and Khadija Ben Selmi from TAP, Khalid Boumiza from Africa Manager, Omar El-Oudi El-Bursa, Zina Mliki from the National TV, and the question that they're all also asking, هل تتوقعون إبرام اتفاق?
Do you expect to reach an agreement with Tunisia this year?
طرحت العلاقة بين الصندوق وتونس.
There are three questions being raised. The relationship between IMF and the government, Tunisian government, what is the reform program, and what is the economic outlook for Tunisia. Firstly, the relationship between the fund and Tunisia is a close relationship, and especially in the recent years, and especially in the light of COVID-19, Tunisia was the one country where we supported Tunisia with $57 million in addition to other aids. And the technical consultation started this year based on a request by the Tunisian government that is working on a reform program and asking the fund to support this program. Hence, we sent several missions to Tunisia. The last one was 3 weeks ago, and we conducted consultations with the authorities there and with our economic and social partners, and what are the challenges, priorities, and how we can address the current crisis there because of accumulated circumstances and in light of the COVID, and how the IMF could support Tunisia. And during the spring meetings, we followed up on those talks, and there is no doubt that Tunisia government had designed a reform program in details, and currently they are consulting this program, and we enhance them to expand the consultations, and especially when it comes to priorities. What are the priorities for Tunisia? First, the independency of the Tunisian economy. Especially this economy witnessed several pressures because of the COVID. Secondly, to work on left the pressure on the economy and to support growth and creation of jobs, and this is a main goal in Tunisia. Thirdly, Tunisia was affected by the Ukrainian crisis in terms of a surge in prices, and indirectly because of its impact on the relationship between Tunisia and EU countries. So it is important to follow the microeconomic policies and to increase the interaction between financial policies on one hand and monetary policy on the other hand. Our consultations are ongoing, and there is a next round between the IMF and the Tunisian government in terms of consultations. When it comes to the outlook, I said Tunisia affected by several crises, starting with the COVID, yet 2021 started to recover. Then it impacted by the war in Ukraine. So what are the priorities this year? To protect from inflation. Secondly, also to protect from especially the vulnerable segment against the surge in the food prices, and also thirdly, structural reforms that we discussed.
National TV, which is more regional, it's also in Arabic. هل لديكم
do you have suggest what could be what are the cost of or the cost bill of when the Middle East and North Africa when it comes to the surge in prices of food and crops? Because of the surge in the prices of wheat and other products, it will have an impact in the next 2 years at least when it comes to also the needs for funding for those countries that are importing as well oil comparing to the previous years. So it will increase to $570 billion. Which so we see then a $40 to $35 billion increase comparing to the last 2 years. So and of course this is different from one country to the other, and the impact on the stability in each country depends on the level of debt, as the countries that are having high level of debts have to address this issue, especially that their needs when it comes to fundings related to the a level of interest rate that is impacted by the international factors, and that will affect also the local markets. Hence, the fund is advising the countries of this region how to mitigate the risks of those shocks by providing a prudent financial policy to reduce the deficits and to increase the surplus and management of public debt as well, especially when it comes to midterm, to provide opportunities for investors and to help the government when it comes to economic burden.
So, Dania, please go ahead and ask your question.
Hello, thank you. My question is, in terms of the Gulf countries, their fiscal break-even oil prices are different between one country to another. For example, Saudi's fiscal break-even for 2022 is expected to fall compared to 2021, while for the UAE, it's expected to increase. I just wanted to know what exactly are the reason for this mixed outlook for fiscal break-even oil prices for MENA oil exporters in 2022. Thank you.
Thank you, Dania. As you know, the break-even price for oil is different from one country to another and different between the current account and the fiscal accounts. Of course, certain number of countries have introduced over the last few years new revenue measures to diversify their resources outside oil revenues, and Saudi is one of them. As you recall, in 2020, Saudi increased the level of the value-added tax, which, as well as also certain number of other fees, which has led to increase in their revenues. The strong recovery in the Saudi economy, especially on the non-oil sector in 2021, also has led to increase in revenues outside oil. Therefore, this is why, combined to the increase in the supply of oil, this has contributed to the reduction in the break-even price on the fiscal side. On the other hand, I would say that the trend in the GCC over the last few years with the strategy to diversify revenues outside oil is a step in the right direction that several countries took recently and proved to be for them not only a way to diversify the revenues, but also to increase or to improve their creditworthiness and the way they are being perceived by the markets.
Thank you, Jihad. Mustafa, please go ahead. We'll take your question.
I will ask my question in Arabic. My question in regard to the UAE, and in the last 6 months, the IMF increased its prescription to the growth in UAE to more than 3%, to 3.5%, and then to 4.2%, according to the recent reports. So what are the reasons for the IMF to increase the outlook for UAE like that, and what are the expectations, especially when it comes to the oil production in UAE? In addition, that UAE announced recently issuing treasury bonds in the local currency, for the first time. So how is the IMF looking into this step to support something that will be a local debt or internal debt in UAE with the local currency? Thank you, Mustafa, for your question. There are many factors here when it comes to the economic recovery in UAE and some of the GCC countries. And here I would like to emphasize on 2 points. The first, the measures that were taken to face COVID since 2020 and to increase the levels of vaccinations in a high pace, especially in 2021, contributed when it comes specifically in UAE and other countries to increase increase the economic cycle and the non-oil sectors. And that was the main motive or driver to witness this unexpected economic recovery. And especially in addition, UAE, it has the Expo 20 bringing tourism back on track and increase the number of tourists in UAE. Second factor that was positive, that the government took steps of reforms by expanding the labor market to provide more opportunities for the citizens and the expats and to facilitate visa measures which had a positive impact on the demand and on the economic status. The recent crisis, the Ukrainian crisis, had a limited negative impact when it comes to the increase of food prices in UAE. Why? Because there were limited commodities that were affected. This is why we will see that in 2022 the level of inflation will be under control between 3 to 3.5%. In addition, also the increase in the oil prices and because of the OPEC Plus agreement helped UAE and other countries to increase their production and to improve their revenues. I will give you an example here. If we looked into the last 4 to 5 years, the interest rate will increase by $1.2 trillion, which is a record unprecedented number, and that will help positively when it comes to the finance in the country. About issuing local bonds, this is a good measure, especially when it comes to develop the financing policies and borrowing policies as well. When we talk about UAE and Saudi Arabia and Egypt, when it comes looking into the global indexes and to develop capital markets and expanding them, that will contribute, of course, in creating a local capital market and a regional even capital market as well.
We'll take your question next, please.
Yes, hi. I'm Magali Aboud from L'Orient Jour, a Lebanese newspaper, and I have some question about the staff level agreement that was made between Lebanon and the IMF. The first one would be about the banking sector. We know that the IMF asked for an audit on the 14 largest banks in Lebanon, but what would be the optimal number of banks in Lebanon, and what would be the ratio, the deposit GDP ratio for Lebanon, the optimal one? Second question would be about the public sector. If Lebanon has the financial assistance from the IMF, will Lebanon be forced to reduce its public sector? Because we know it's really large. So if he lays off some public employees or not. And the third question would be about the gold. Will the gold be a collector for the financial assistance of the IMF? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Magali. Let me maybe start with the last question. The fund support to any country, including Lebanon, has no collateral. What the fund usually tries through programs is to help countries accelerate the implementation of reforms that are deeply needed in order to address imbalances or to allow the countries through structural reforms to increase the level of growth. And therefore, the staff level agreement that Lebanon and the fund have reached in April 7 has this as an objective, is how the fund can provide through financial assistance and also by mobilizing assistance from bilateral and other multilateral donors can help Lebanon, address the protracted and multi-pronged type of crisis that Lebanon is going through and how to help Lebanon accelerate the recovery. Answering your first question on the financial sector, this is part of I would say, the multi-type of crisis that Lebanon is facing because of the collapse that we saw in finances that has led to the crisis in the financial sector. And therefore, for Lebanon to address the current crisis, but also to accelerate the recovery, it's very important to have a financial sector that is able to finance the economy and finance the recovery. And for that, it's very important to look at the financial situation of banks. There is no magic number. The idea is to have a broad assessment of the quality of assets, the quality of the balance sheet of the banks, and make sure that they are well equipped to and well restructured for them to be able to finance the recovery. Your second question on the size of the public sector. Well, as you know, Magali, Lebanon is currently facing a protracted crisis that over the last 2 years has been aggravated. It's not only a financial crisis, it's also a fiscal crisis, and that has led to huge increase in inflation because of the monetization of the deficit. And also one of the related issue is the situation of some of the state-owned entities like the energy sector. Therefore, it's very important to address in a comprehensive way the fiscal situation in Lebanon by reducing the level of deficit, creating a fiscal system and a tax system that is progressive and fair, and also by gradually allowing Lebanon to have primary surpluses in the budget. This would require reforming the public sector, reforming some of the public entities, and also strengthening confidence. And this also requires to address issues of corruption, governance, and reforming the public sector. Last but not the least, it's very important to address the huge pressure that this crisis is having on low-income people and vulnerable groups. And therefore, an integral part of the program is to widen the social protection system and provide a safety net through a better targeting system to reach those who are the most affected by the crisis.
Thank you. We have a question from Lara, and then because of the time constraint, we'll just take all the Lebanon questions at a go. Lara, if you're around, please go ahead.
Yes. يعطيكم العافية أستاذ جهاد.
Thank you very much, Jihad and Wafa. I have two questions. The first one is about the press release by the IMF after the staff agreement with Lebanon. In the press release, the IMF says that Lebanon, or the central bank in Lebanon, should move to a new fiscal system and increase its foreign currencies reserve. So is the reserve at this point in the Central Bank of Lebanon negative? And if this is the case, will the IMF still sign the agreement with Lebanon? And second, in the recovery plan that was suggested by the Lebanese government, although unofficially, they were talking about giving back some of the accounts that were lost by the Lebanese people in the banks. Is it possible for the Lebanese people to find again these sums in foreign currencies? And also, is it possible that this may have an impact on inflation in Lebanon? Thank you, Lara. We have a question by Lara. After the agreement with Lebanon, is there a specific time given for Lebanon to start the implementation? We have similar question from Patricia Jalad from Nida Al-Watan. Let me start with Lara and then Kausar. Your first question, Lara, the government in Lebanon adopted a plan to fix the crisis and started by working on the banking sector crisis in Lebanon, which is a priority, and also working on the debt issue. All these measures request an effort and participation by all. When it comes to the monetary policy, this policy should be trustworthy. And it should be flexible enough and modern in order to preserve monetary stability. This is one part. The second part is to restructure the banking system so it will be able to finance the economic activity and bring recovery to the economic sector. There is also a question about the time given by the IMF for Lebanon. Usually when we have an agreement with a country, we are basing this agreement on a series of measures adopted by the government in its recovery plan. So as you know, Kausar, the reforms should be implemented as quickly as possible. And we know that the situation of the Lebanese economy is dire. And there is also a negative impact of the situation on inflation that is very high and on development that was low. It also has an impact on social stability. There is another question also about the IMF Council. Will it sign the agreement with Lebanon after the legislative elections? And what about the requests and the conditions set for the government in Lebanon? Well, it's a very important question. The agreement that was reached is based on a series of measures that the government in Lebanon should be taking. We will be working together in order to provide all the support to the Lebanese government in order to have the agreement be approved by the IMF.
So the outlook in Morocco decreased according to the IMF. Why is that? Is it because of the weak agricultural season outcome, or is it because of the situation in Ukraine? And how can we overcome those challenges in Morocco? In fact, the Moroccan economy was affected by COVID, and in 2021 was able to bring back or to come back in terms of the economic recovery. Why? Because of the Moroccan government took serious steps and measures. It was as well very fast in taking those steps, including vaccinations, and also conducting several steps to protect its economic sectors and to improve its the institutional capabilities and the businesses to within the economic cycle. This is why Morocco was be able to come back to on the economic trajectory according to a very good level of interest rates. Afterwards, yes, the Moroccan economy was affected by the situation in terms of drought, to be more specific, that impacted on the agricultural sector, in addition to the Ukrainian crisis and the surge in the commodities and oil prices, and indirectly being affected by this crisis in different markets when it comes to trade partnerships with other countries, especially with European countries. There is no doubt that today the Moroccan government is taking a number of measures, for example, supporting the transportation sector in terms of goods and persons to reduce the prices here and to support this segment even from the time of COVID, to shield some of the societal segments from this negative impacts, and to work on as well social policies and measures to reactivate different economic sectors that was affected by COVID, like the air transportation and similar sectors. There's another question. Why the IMF increased the economic outlook when it comes to Qatar? Is Qatar hosting the World Cup a factor in this? Thank you for this question. Qatar, including other GCC countries, were able to swiftly face COVID-19 by taking several measures, including also some financial support to the most affected sectors in those countries. And this improvement in the growth was simultaneously also in the increase of the oil prices that helped in the overall economic growth rate, in addition to a number of investments that took place by the Iraqi government to prepare for the World Cup that will take place in 2022, increasing the general investment and the economic sector, and then the increase of the natural gas that will enable Qatar to be the biggest producer for LNG in the world, and to improve the growth rates in the midterm.
Also from Raif Shihab.
In Jordan, what are your expectations when it comes to the Jordanian economy? Yes, what is the outlook, the economic outlook here for Jordan? Thank you for this question. Jordan was able to face a number of crises, the COVID, increase of the interest rate internationally, and recently also facing the Ukrainian crisis and its impact on the food prices, as the Jordanian government was able to continue on its path towards reform. As you know, in the beginning of the COVID, the first program by the IMF was adjusted actually to take into consideration the importance of increasing the expenditures, especially in socially, to enable Jordan to face COVID crisis, and it was able to also increase its preparedness when it comes to health services and vaccinations, and to improving of the economic situation in Jordan. But there is no doubt that Jordan is suffering since actually several years ago a high number of unemployment, especially among the youth, and the COVID had a negative impact when it comes to the number of unemployment, and this is something that they need to work on in the coming next years to improve the economy there, to empower the youth by providing jobs.
Dear, if you want to go ahead and ask your last question. We can.
Good evening. I will ask my question in Arabic. Please go ahead. My question is in regards to Egypt. I heard my previous colleagues talking about the questions related to Egypt, but my question is what is there a time frame here that the IMF will approve the loan that will be provided to Egypt? And the second part of my question is, you witnessed the decisions that were taken by Egyptian government yesterday in regards to the private sector in Egypt, and if you can, what is your intake on that? Thank you. As you know, we have consultations to prepare the negotiations for this program. I'm here. I mean the reform and the restructuring Egypt. So in the last 2 years, that was the way that we having a governmental program which is main pillars, and we having consultations with them in regards of those points. Secondly, if you ask me about when exactly, we don't have a timeline here. What was the second part of the question? You answered already about the statement by the Egyptian president in regards to the private sector yesterday. As you know, Ahmed, back to the first program in 2016 and the second program we suggested to Egypt is to increase the private sector participation, and for obvious reasons. There is a dynamic private sector in Egypt that could lead the Egyptian economy, and also how to fund the private sector. Secondly, Egypt is in need for securing employment, especially among youth, and the private sector is in a better role, a position comparing to the government in creating jobs, especially when it comes to SMEs and in terms of initiatives and startups. This is why the role of the private sector is essential. The role of the government should be complementary when it comes to the work of the private sector. In addition, with our consultations with the Egyptian government to emphasize on this, and that the reforms or the policies in terms of structural reform will be parallel to those efforts, and to create the highest level of economic competitiveness, and to benefit from the huge scale of the Egyptian economy, especially regionally speaking.
You can find the MCD report online. Please join us tomorrow at 7 a.m. Washington time for the press briefing on the Africa Regional Economic Outlook. Thank you again for joining.